March 12, 2024. The city is quiet in the way only power centers ever are silent, but never asleep. Streetlights hum faintly along Constitution Avenue. The marble columns of federal buildings glow pale under artificial light. Inside one of them, several floors below ground level, air-conditioned rooms pulse with servers, algorithms, and balance sheets measured not in dollars, but in trillions. No crowds are gathered. No alarms are ringing. No emergency session is announced. And yet, something historic is happening. At this exact moment, the United States has crossed a financial threshold no empire in modern history has ever safely returned from. The national debt has quietly surged past $38 trillion, a number so large it no longer registers as real to the human mind. But what makes this moment extraordinary is not the size of the debt. It is the method by which it is disappearing. Not through repayment, not through taxation, not through austerity, but through monetization, a process so technical, so abstract, and so carefully obscured that most Americans will never realize it's happening, even as it reshapes their lives. This is the central paradox of the modern financial system. The debt is growing faster than ever, yet the system insists it is manageable. The money supply expands, yet officials claim inflation is transitory. Purchasing power erodes, yet wages appear to rise. Somewhere between those contradictions lies the truth. To understand how the Federal Reserve is invisibly erasing $38 trillion in debt, we must go back, not to crisis, but to intention. The story begins in 1913 with the creation of the Federal Reserve itself. Born from panic, secrecy, and compromise, the Fed was designed as a stabilizer, a lender of last resort meant to prevent bank runs and financial collapse. But embedded within its structure was something far more powerful: the authority to create money. At first, this power was limited. Gold constrained it. Discipline enforced it. But wars have a way of rewriting rules. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. Each crisis pushed the boundary further. Each emergency justified more intervention. And with every expansion, the idea took deeper root. Debt could be managed, not by paying it, but by absorbing it into the system itself. By the 1970s, the final barrier fell. In 1971, President Richard Nixon severed the dollar's final link to gold. In one televised address, the dollar became a purely fiat instrument, backed not by metal, but by confidence. From that moment forward, debt no longer had a natural limit. Fast forward to 2008. The global financial system stands on the edge of collapse. Banks fail. Markets freeze. Credit evaporates. In response, the Federal Reserve deploys a tool once considered unthinkable: quantitative easing. Trillions of dollars are created digitally and used to purchase government debt and financial assets. The official explanation is stabilization. The real consequence is precedent. For the first time, the Fed proves it can absorb massive quantities of debt without immediate catastrophe. Inflation remains muted. Markets recover. The world breathes again. And a lesson is learned quietly, decisively, permanently. Debt does not need to be repaid if it can be monetized. Then comes 2020. A pandemic shuts down the global economy. Governments spend without restraint. Deficits explode. The Federal Reserve intervenes at a scale never seen before, injecting liquidity, suppressing interest rates, and expanding its balance sheet to historic levels. By 2024, the consequences are no longer theoretical. Interest payments alone now exceed national defense spending. Trillions are rolled over, refinanced, and quietly absorbed. The debt clock spins faster not because repayment is expected, but because monetization has become the operating system itself. This is not default in the traditional sense. It is something far subtler: a silent liquidation. The architects of this system are not villains in dark rooms. They are economists, policymakers, central bankers trained in models, probabilities, and risk management. They speak of financial stability, of tools, of mandates. But behind the language lies a hard mathematical reality. There is no political path to repayment, no tax base large enough, no spending cut severe enough, which leaves only one path forward. Debt erased not with scissors, but with dilution. This documentary is not about conspiracy. It is about mechanism. How Treasury issuance, Federal Reserve balance sheets, suppressed interest rates, and controlled inflation work together as a single system. How purchasing power becomes the release valve. How savers subsidize debtors without consent. And how the greatest transfer of wealth in modern history unfolds, not through force, but through accounting. What you are about to hear is not speculation. It is structure. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The debt that could not be paid. By the early 2000s, the United States had already crossed a quiet threshold. Debt was no longer something meant to be eliminated. It had become something to be managed. After the final balanced budget in 2001, deficits returned, and this time they never left. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were funded not through taxes, but borrowing. Entitlement spending expanded as the population aged. Financial crises were met not with contraction, but intervention. Each decision seemed rational in isolation. Together, they formed a system with no exit. By 2008, total federal debt stood near $10 trillion. Alarm bells rang, but the system held. When the global financial crisis hit, policymakers faced a choice that would define the next generation. Allow the system to collapse, or absorb the debt into the center of the financial architecture itself. They chose absorption, the birth of modern monetization. The term monetization sounds technical, even harmless. In reality, it represents one of the most powerful transformations in monetary history. At its core, monetization occurs when a central bank creates money to purchase government debt. Before 2008, this was considered dangerous. After 2008, it became policy. Under quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve created trillions of dollars digitally, money that did not exist before, and used it to buy treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Officially, this was not printing money. It was liquidity support. But functionally, the result was the same. The government borrowed. The Fed created money. The debt was absorbed. Markets stabilized. Banks survived. The economy recovered slowly. And something critical happened beneath the surface. The taboo was broken. How the machine actually works. To understand how $38 trillion can be erased invisibly, one must understand the choreography between three institutions. The U.S. Treasury, the Federal Reserve, the banking system. The Treasury issues debt to fund government spending. Primary dealers, large banks, purchase that debt at auction. Then the Federal Reserve steps in. Through open market operations, the Fed buys that debt from the banks using newly created reserves. These reserves sit on bank balance sheets, expanding liquidity across the system. The debt still exists on paper, but its ownership has changed. What was once owed to the public is now effectively owed to the central bank. And a central bank does not demand repayment the way markets do. It can roll debt indefinitely. It can reinvest maturities. It can suppress yields. This is how debt loses its teeth. Interest rates, the pressure valve. Debt only becomes dangerous when interest rates rise. For decades, interest rates trended downward. Some believe this was natural, a result of demographics, globalization, and productivity. But after 2008, rate suppression became intentional. The Federal Reserve cut rates to near zero and kept them there for years. This made borrowing cheap not just for households and corporations, but for the government itself. As debt exploded, interest costs remained manageable. Until they didn't. By the early 2020s, inflation surged. The Fed raised rates aggressively. Suddenly, interest payments ballooned. By 2024, interest on the national debt exceeded national defense spending. This was the moment when the system revealed its constraint. High rates are incompatible with massive debt, which means rates cannot remain high for long. The logic is circular and inescapable. Inflation is not a failure, it is a feature. Inflation is often described as an unintended consequence. In reality, it is the release valve. When prices rise faster than wages and savings, the real value of debt declines. A dollar owed in the future is worth less than a dollar borrowed today. This is not accidental. Historically, heavily indebted governments have relied on inflation to reduce their burdens. From post-war America to modern emerging markets, the pattern is consistent. What makes the current era different is subtlety. Inflation is managed not explosive, but persistent. Just high enough to erode purchasing power. Just low enough to maintain confidence. Over a decade, even modest inflation can erase enormous amounts of real debt. Quietly, legally, systemically. The hidden cost who really pays. Monetization does not distribute pain evenly. It transfers it. Those who save in cash lose purchasing power. Those on fixed incomes fall behind. Wages lag asset prices. Meanwhile, debtors benefit. Governments, corporations, asset holders. This is why inequality widens during periods of aggressive monetary expansion. Assets inflate first. Labor adjusts last. No vote is cast. No law is passed. No announcement is made. The transfer happens automatically. This is why monetization is politically irresistible. Why stopping is impossible. Could the Federal Reserve stop monetizing debt? In theory, yes. In practice, no. Ending monetization would require allowing interest rates to rise sharply, forcing the Treasury to refinance trillions at market rates, triggering asset crashes, collapsing pension funds, inducing mass defaults. The system is now reflexive. Markets depend on central bank support. Governments depend on low borrowing costs. Citizens depend on stability. Monetization is no longer a policy choice. It is a necessity. Historical precedents. History offers warnings, but rarely exact parallels. Ancient Rome diluted its currency. Post-war Britain inflated away debt. Japan monetized quietly for decades. The United States is attempting something unprecedented in scale. Global reserve currency monetization. The dollar's dominance buys time, but not immunity. Confidence is the final pillar. And confidence, once lost, does not return easily. The illusion of control. Central banks insist they can normalize policy. History suggests otherwise. Once debt reaches this scale, reversal becomes destabilization. The system can slow. It can pause. But it cannot unwind. Which brings us to the present. $38 trillion is not a number meant to be paid. It is a number meant to be absorbed by time. The silent contract. Every fiat currency rests on an unspoken agreement. That money will hold value. That rules will be respected. That erosion will be limited. Monetization stretches that contract. Not breaking it outright, but thinning it. The debt does not vanish. It is socialized across everyone who holds dollars. And most will never realize when they pay their share. By the time the numbers cross $38 trillion, the story is no longer about accounting. It is about architecture. What you have just seen is not a temporary response to crisis, nor an emergency policy waiting to be reversed. It is a structure carefully assembled over decades designed to function in a world where debt has outgrown every traditional method of repayment. The United States did not wake up one morning and choose monetization. It arrived there step by step, crisis by crisis, decision by decision, until no other path remained politically survivable or economically stable. And that is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this system. The Federal Reserve did not invent debt, nor did it invent inflation. What it refined was something far more subtle, the ability to stretch time. Monetization allows governments to borrow from the future without formally defaulting in the present. It transforms insolvency into duration. What cannot be paid today is rolled forward, diluted, and absorbed across years, sometimes generations. This is why the debt does not feel like a crisis. There are no breadlines, no emergency broadcasts, no sudden collapse. The cost arrives quietly through prices that rise faster than wages, savings that buy less each year, and a growing gap between those who own assets and those who do not. The system works precisely because it is gradual. Throughout history, societies burdened by extreme debt have faced a limited set of choices. They could default openly, triggering chaos and collapse. They could impose austerity, cutting deeply into social stability. Or they could inflate, allowing the currency to carry the burden. Modern monetization is simply inflation's most sophisticated form. It is inflation managed by algorithms, balance sheets, and central bank language. It replaces blunt force with calibration. Instead of dramatic collapse, it offers controlled erosion. But erosion, by definition, never stops on its own. What makes this moment different is not the size of the debt, but the absence of an off-ramp. Every attempt to normalize policy collides with the same constraint. Higher interest rates make the debt unserviceable. Every attempt to shrink the balance sheet risks market instability. The system has become reflexive, dependent on its own interventions. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural one. No individual policymaker can unwind it. No election can reverse it. The incentives push relentlessly in one direction: continued monetization, continued dilution, continued delay. The debt is not being ignored. It is being managed through time. For the average citizen, this reality is difficult to see because it does not appear as a single event. It appears as a feeling, a sense that money no longer stretches as far, that progress feels slower despite effort, that the future seems more expensive than the past. These are not coincidences. They are symptoms of a system redistributing burden without naming it. The greatest strength of monetization is also its greatest risk: confidence. As long as the public believes the system is under control, it remains stable. Markets function. Institutions endure. The dollar retains its role. But confidence is not infinite. It is built slowly and lost suddenly. History is clear on this point. Once faith in monetary discipline breaks, the transition is rarely gentle. That moment has not arrived, but the conditions are forming. The question, then, is not whether monetization will continue. It will. The real question is how far it can go before the trade-offs become visible enough to challenge belief. How much dilution can occur before trust erodes? How long can real wages lag without consequence? How much debt can be absorbed before the global system demands adjustment? These are not questions with dates or deadlines. They are pressures, and pressures accumulate. It is tempting to look for villains in this story. But monetization is not driven by malice. It is driven by math. A political system unwilling to cut spending. A population unwilling to accept austerity. A financial system built on perpetual growth. Monetization sits at the intersection of those realities. It is the path of least resistance. And yet, understanding the system changes your relationship to it. Once you see that debt is not repaid but transferred, that inflation is not accidental but instrumental, that stability is not free but funded quietly, you begin to recognize the hidden contract you are part of. Every dollar you hold, every salary negotiation, every long-term plan, all exist within this framework. The United States is not alone in this experiment, but it is the largest. And because the dollar sits at the center of global finance, the consequences extend far beyond its borders. This is not merely an American story. It is a global one. Monetization does not end with a crash. It ends with a transformation, sometimes gradual, sometimes abrupt, sometimes disguised as reform. History does not repeat, but it does rhyme. And the rhyme here is familiar. Empires rarely fall from debt alone. They fall when the mechanisms designed to manage debt exhaust the confidence that sustains them. $38 trillion is not just a number. It is a measure of how far the system has stretched. And monetization is the method by which it continues silently, methodically, invisibly. The debt is not gone. It has simply been distributed across time. And time, eventually, demands its due. If you understand this system, you are no longer just observing history. You are standing inside it. And the question is not whether monetization will shape the future, but how prepared society will be when its limits are finally reached.